thought, yeah, okay.
My wife told me about it yesterday. She said it was Cristiano Ronaldo.
Very good. Well done.
Was it?
Yes, there was.
Yep.
My wife asked me who's Ronaldo. I was like, what?
The sponsors of the tournament got wiped away from the table. Wonderful.
All right, friends. The truth is that I forgot that we're still in the middle of week 3 of Mishnah 10, discussing the students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and we're now up to the discussion of the first student, which was Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Now, David was, from the people that are on now, I think David heard my story of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. So I just want to summarize it quickly for those that didn't hear about it last week. Eliezer ben Hyrcanus is involved in one of the greatest debates with his colleagues in history, Talmudic debates, halachic debates. So just in short, the debate was about a particular oven that was made up of separate parts. Generally, the way it works is when you have something made of earthenware, if it becomes impure, it has to be broken. But there's a whole question about if it's made up of, and then the only way to do it is you break it. That's how you could purify it. And then if you have an oven, is an oven part of the ground, etc. Okay, lots of questions. And then there was a debate about this special type of oven, whether it can become impure or not. And Rabbi Eliezer held one opinion, and his colleagues all disagreed with him. The process in Judaism is that we always follow the majority. Rabbi Eliezer said he wasn't willing to accept the opinion of his colleagues, even though they were the majority, because he had a tradition going back. If you remember when we discussed Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, he was a man with the most incredible memory. He always remembered everything that he had learned, never forgot. And his memory told him that in the previous generation they had already discussed this, and they had said this particular opinion. That wasn't recorded by his other colleagues, and therefore they decided to rejudge the case, and he refused to accept their approach. Now, the halacha works that you go through based on the majority at the time, unless it has been clearly recorded as being the previous case and in a different situation. And Rabbi Eliezer decides to make miracles happen to prove his case. He's a tremendous rabbi, saint, pious man. He first says, if I'm right, let the walls of the study hall cave in. We start to cave in. And Rabbi Yeshua, who's the next person we're going to be talking about, hopefully if we get time today, he said, sorry, the walls are not a proof. We have to decide based on our logic, and that's not a proof. And then he says, okay, if I'm correct, let the water prove. And let the river outside, flow upwards in the wrong direction. And that's what happened. And Rabbi Yeshua again said, sorry, the water, we cannot allow on miracles, that is not a proof. Finally, Rabbi Eliezer said, let a voice from heaven come down and say he was correct. The voice from heaven came down and said that Rabbi Eliezer is correct. And Rabbi Yeshua's response was, one of the most famous lines, which was, Torah leiva shamayim, the Torah is not in heavens. Which means that once the Torah has been given down to us, God has given us processes of how we're supposed to derive it. And once that process has been given, we can't rely on anything supernatural to give us teachings. There was one time that we can get supernatural teachings, and that was the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. So I've actually, on a different Tuesday night shir, I gave this topic and I spoke about this, but this is actually the story. These are the people that the debate happens with, particularly with Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Yeshua says that the Torah is not in heaven, and the Talmud recalls that in heaven, God said, Nitzchunai banai nitzchunai. My sons were victorious, they were victorious. Now, this is a powerful line. A heavenly voice comes down and says, Rabbi Eliezer is correct, and who do we say is the victorious one? Not the voice from heaven. Rabbi Yeshua, who says that the Torah is not in heaven. How does that work? Why is that? So the answer for this is simply because as after the Torah was given, the Torah gave us principles. And the principle was going to be that everything in the Torah is going to stay exactly as it was in the tradition. The only way anytime a decision can be changed or made that can have any major repercussions is if the majority of the scholars at the time vote on it. We cannot rely on miracles. Why is this so important? Because just a short while later, you're going to have the advent of Christianity and other religions that came across a guy by the name of, we call him, JC, Yoshka Pandra, who wakes up one day and says, sorry, the Torah is gone. Already he was his students, Paul, that said that the Torah is gone. So what protects you from that? They say, well, God, Jesus had a vision, right? What's going to protect you from falling into that trap? The Torah protects it. And that's why ultimately God says, if they were willing to say to the heavenly voice, we're not going to listen to you. Now I know that they're in safe hands. And even when the strongest forces of Christianity and all other type of cults and groups that are going to try, I'm not saying that Christianity is a cult, by the way, that all other types of cults and groups will try to have people having different types of visions and saying the Torah is no longer real and true, we will know, hold on a second, the Torah can never be changed. The only one that could make a new law in the Torah is Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses. And so that's the story in short. But as a result of this, one of the greatest rabbis in the time gets ostracized. He's forced to leave he's not allowed allowed into the study hall. This is Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurknus, one of the great rabbis of his time. He's not allowed to stay in the study hall. And it's obvious this was his entire life. His entire life was studying and devotion to Torah, had sacrificed all his wealth, his father's wealth, as I spoke about a few weeks ago, in order to be able to study Torah. But because he went on his principle was tradition. My tradition, my memory that I remembered from the previous generation. But because he allowed that to overcome the principle of the Torah, which was that we go based on the majority, because of that, the rabbi said that he wasn't allowed to continue. He wasn't willing to accept the ruling of his colleagues, and he was forced out. It was towards the later part in his life, in any case. But the story goes on that even though he was ostracized, he wasn't allowed to come back into the house of study. They still sent people to visit him and to study from him, and students. He still had a lot to teach. He was still a very pious and holy man, but you had to ultimately accept the concept of the majority. This is that was the protection system of Judaism. Towards the end of his life, he became sick, and all his colleagues that had argued with him still held him very high esteem, come to visit him. And while they were visiting, he said to them, he was quite harsh with them, where have you been? How come you haven't come earlier, etc. Some of them had, some of them hadn't, particularly Rabbi Akiva, who was very close with him, and of course, the greatest rabbi in that time. The head rabbi of the time was Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Gamliel was the Nasi. We'll talk about Rabbi Yeshua in a moment. And they had a discussion in Torah, and Rabbi Eliezer said at the end of his life, he's like, I'm like a Torah which has been covered up and unwrapped. And what he was trying to tell his students, he says, his colleagues, he said, as a result of your ostracization and my stubbornness, that I wasn't willing to accept the rulership of the Torah, I wasn't able to teach everything that I have. And now I'm going to die with it all in my head. Which I think for a person on his stature, that was the greatest regret that he had, that he wasn't able to fully give over all his teachings, and he felt that was as a result of his stubbornness. for not willing to accept what the other rabbis understood to be the rule, which that, by the way, does remain the rule in Judaism till this very day, that we go based on majority. They had a discussion with him, and a short while later, they asked him a question, which was something that they needed to know. The tradition from previous generations was a question of something is pure or impure, and he answered the question with the word tahor, pure, and as he said the word tahor, his soul left his body. He died at that moment. And Rabbi Yeshua, who was the man that was the head of the one that ostracized him, but he was also the Av Beit Din, he said, Rabbi Eliezer, the excommunication against you has been now removed. We are officially removing it, and you're fully accepted back into the circle. But obviously that meant that that was only going to be in burial, because when it comes to the concept of cherem, which is a Jewish concept of excommunication, one of the ways that to a certain degree even applies till today. For example, if a person refuses to give a get, the rabbis don't have the ability to necessarily fine somebody or imprison people, but what they can do is they can say that a person can be excommunicated. He should not be allowed to participate in minyanim and all those things. And usually the way it works, that if a person passes away and there's still a cherem on them, then they buried somewhat to the outskirts of the cemetery, like towards the fringes, and not only that, they're also place a stone on their grave, like a large stone, to show that this person was excommunicated during his lifetime. Now, obviously, most people, hopefully, are willing to change their ways beforehand, or whatever, whether it's a get or something like that. They're willing to change their ways, and they don't die in such a way. So Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, of course, did not want him to die in excommunication. So he says, and he pronounced, the excommunication is taken off, and Rabbi Eliezer was given all the royalties of one of the great rabbis of the time. But the rabbis felt that they had to show a lesson, make a lesson of the story of Rabbi Eliezer, particularly because of his greatness and his piety, that if we allow people that claim to have visions and people that claim to do miracles, etc., to make ruling in Torah, then we actually going to take away all the foundations of the Jewish world. So that's the story of Rabbi Eliezer. Now that's in a very important introduction. I told part of that to David last week. I don't remember if anybody else that's on now was on then, but I want to show you, as a result of that, what Rabbi Eliezer himself says in Pirkei Avot. Let's look at what he says, because it's all related. I'd love to see here. I'm thinking about trying to do a little bit different this year. Really, before I just give my own interpretations to everything, I'd love to know how other people think of it and get more feedback to see, because all these Pirkei Avot is something which is relatively simple to understand usually, and can have layers of understanding, and I'm sure many of you have what to add when it comes to this. So Rabbi Eliezer said, first of all, that the honor of your fellow should be as important to you as it is your own honor. If you make sure that you honor people as much as you worry about your own honor, then what ends up happening, people are happy. People end up being persuaded and listening, and ultimately you are respected. And don't be easily angered. Now, these two lines are obviously connected, because he says, when you are worried and more careful and meticulous about the respect of your fellow friends and making sure that they're respected, you won't easily get angry at them, because usually when a person gets angry at their fellow man, that is a sign of disrespect. So we will try to find ways to overcome that. Now, Before I look into any other interpretations, I'd like to know if anybody else has something to comment on this line. Based on what we spoke about the story of Rabbi Eliezer, do any of you think that there's a connection between Rabbi Eliezer's history and the statement that he says?
May I? Yes. First of all, I'm just having trouble with the translation here, because yichvod, so the honor, but to me the honor doesn't really translate well to the story. I'm trying to balance that against, say, the concept of self-esteem.
Okay, I'm not sure what you're trying to say. So you're saying you see a connection between the story that happened with Rabbi Eliezer and his statement?
Oh, absolutely. It's a tricky thing, and you've mentioned it before, where people can argue but still maintain a healthy respect for each other, attack the argument, not the person. Maybe that's the key part of it, is attack the argument, not the person. And if the focus shifts from the topic to the personality of the individual, that's where the honor maybe is lost.
Yes, that's very true. Good point. Good point. I suppose on a simple level, it means that he felt somewhat that maybe he was not respectful enough to his colleagues, or that they were not respectful enough to him. Sorry.
Yeah, but again, I'm thinking when it comes to Talmudic argument, some of those debates can get very heated, very passionate. But to know how far to go with such an argument,
right,
when does it cross the line that it becomes attacking the individual?
Sure. Well, that's what happens with him, right? Ultimately, what happens with him is he felt that it's a unique case because there's thousands of arguments. As a matter of fact, you barely have a page in the Talmud where there isn't an argument. But as usually there's usually on an average page in the Talmud you'll have something like 30 arguments or whatever it is, 10 at least. But they always are, the people that are arguing are usually the best of friends. There's only one case that, or one of the very few, and this is of course the most famous case, of where it actually ended in somebody being ostracized, because whatever would happen is whenever there was a debate, always they would have, if it was really practical, they would have a vote on it, and then they would go on majority. And in all cases, the minority would accept it. And there's hundreds of stories within the Talmud where people had one opinion and the majority voted against them. And then those people tell them, no, you do. They told their communities and their families, you do not like I hold, but like the majority, because that's the law. That's a very important law in Judaism.
Yep, but
what happened to him, the reason why it got to this point is because he wasn't willing to accept that.
Sure, but the cherem thing, I mean, it's, for me, cherem becomes personal.
So for you, are you saying that you think that the rabbis made a mistake?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's where the Talmudic discourse went too far.
Okay, so I would argue with you, and I would say that history is not in your thinking. History has proved that the rabbis were 100% correct. Not only that, but they if not for their actions, we don't know where we would have been within Judaism. If Judaism would even be in existence, we would all be Christians today, to a certain degree. If not for their actions. I don't think people understand the severity of his actions and why the rabbis went to that extreme. When a person refuses to give a get, which is a terrible thing, leaving a woman as an aguna, in that case, we would be willing to put a person in a cherem
Yeah.
certainly in this case.
Sorry, yeah, I wasn't referring to general use of cherem, but in this specific example with Rabbi Eliezer.
Why? Okay. I'm just thinking that maybe some other people are thinking that. This is a common thing. I actually once had to give a shir where a person came to me, learned the story and said, this is the most ridiculous story just because he's proven himself, he's got everything on his side, and then the rabbis don't like what he says and they put him in cherem.
Yeah, I have a problem with it too. Yep.
Okay, so is that your problem, the way I explained it?
Because putting him in cherem, it's not a reflection on the argument he's putting forward. It's completely silencing him. It's completely removing
He was
him
not
from.
silenced. The way, okay, so this is what I important, and I really want you to understand this concept. And Joe, I really appreciate that you bring it up because this is, I think, a fundamental concept that has to really be understood within the Jewish halachic workings. Fundamental understanding is that argument is not only allowed, but it's encouraged. That's a fundamental concept within Judaism. Argument is encouraged. In other words, we don't want people to say yes if they disagree. But on the other hand, there's also a principle of how we come to laws. And the principle is that you could debate, but ultimately when it comes to the hierarchy of serious halakha, there is a place where these things are decided. And those decided are by the top scholars of the time. And then they must vote on it. But once that vote has come into place, the people that were against it, their opinion falls away. In other words, their opinion still counts, it will still be recorded, we'll still study it, we'll still analyze it, but it will not be the rule, it will not be the halakha. And that has to be accepted.
Yep.
So they had no problem with Rabbi Eliezer arguing with them. That was 100% fine. Their problem was that he wasn't willing to accept that as the halakha. And that was what was unique about this case. It was an uncommon case, almost probably not even a practical case. But he was not willing to accept the halakha. In every other case, the rabbis would argue. There's Rabbi Akiva, right? The most famous of them all. He argued lots of times. Many of the time, the law does not follow his opinion. But what does he say? Accept the opinion of the majority. But if he were not to say that, then he's going against the whole of the Torah. So Rabbi Eliezer ends up, in his theory, he thinks that he was correct and he has a point. But at the end of the day, that would destabilize the entire halachic foundation.
But
That means anybody can stand up and disagree and just decide what they want to do. Everybody can disagree, but there has to be an ultimate conclusion and law.
I agree, and
Otherwise,
I understand.
chaos and havoc. Correct?
I understand the point, but here I'm wondering if it's a thought crime rather than a practical crime, because sure, to go against the Beis Din, absolutely, and that's usually measured by an action, a practical action, something that changes the environment. Here, he's being prosecuted for thinking differently.
No, that's 100%. No one is ever prosecuted. That's why I'm clarifying this. No one is ever prosecuted for thinking differently or arguing. Look at any page in the Talmud. There's more arguments recorded in the Talmud than any other book in all of history. Not only that, we praise our argument partners. We're fully for it.
So
he's allowed to think differently. He should think differently. We don't even want him to say. We don't even require him to say, you're right. He doesn't even have to agree with you right, but he has to accept the final decision. That's what you have to do.
So I'll just clarify. So his crime, in Rabbit's ears, his crime was to not verbally agree with the ruling.
No,
I mean, he didn't actually go ahead and build an oven.
Spiritual powers to try to go against the ruling, and dig his heels in and says, "I hear you guys have done it. You've got the majority vote, but I'm not going to accept it, and I will do everything in my power to make it go against what you're saying." And not encourage people to follow that approach in this case.
So is that documented that he was encouraging an insurrection? He
He
was
made the walls of he got all spiritual forces on his side, right? He was a very powerful, very pious man. This is a holy man that knew all the Torah by heart. He gets the walls of the Bet Midrash to start coming in. He gets the water to flow. All these things. He gets a voice from heaven to come down to say that he's right.
sure.
What do you need all that? That's not the way. That's not the system. The
But
system is we argue, we use logic. If you want to disprove, you want to change people's mind. When it comes to halacha, there's only one way to disprove to change people's minds.
I accept
By
that.
the way, I just wonder, has anybody else got anything else to
Yeah.
argue about? It's a conversation with me and Joe,
Sure.
but I'm sure some of you else have something to either disagree or argue, or I don't know if you're. Before we go on, I think it's important because let's finish the Mishnah and see what happens.
Mm.
Now, Rabbi Eliezer ends up saying, "V'shuv yom echad lifnei mitascha." Now, I think he said this earlier on in his life. Return one day before your death. Return means return to your true self. But ultimately, Rabbi Eliezer does apologize, or does, to a certain degree, repent his ways. And that's when he passes away. And that's why Rabbi Yeshua removes the ostracization for him, because he had changed and he had accepted his colleague's decision, right? He had accepted the majority, the rule of the Torah, ultimately. So he says, do it one day before you die. But when his students asked him, what does it mean one day before you die? You never know when you're going to die. He said, exactly. That's why every single day you should be doing teshuvah. Teshuvah, shuv, the word teshuvah means return. Return to what? To your true self. The true self is your essence, is connected to Hashem. Now look what else he says. He says, it's one of the harshest statements within this rest of his thing you're going to see. He was a little bit of a bitter man about what happened to him. He says, he said, warm yourself up by the fire of the sages. Be very careful of their flame, their embers, that you shouldn't be burned. Because their bite is the bite of a fox. And their sting is the sting of a scorpion. Their hiss is the hiss of a serpent. Oops. Whoa.
He's angry.
You think?
Okay, one second. I lost the place. I was trying to scroll down.
And no, that's only
the hiss is saraf. The hiss is the hiss of a serpent. And all the words are like the fiery coals. So what did you say, Nach? You said that he sounds angry?
I said he is angry.
yeah, and that's only the parts they could print.
No, this is what he says. Okay, so the way I understand this, and I could be wrong. First of all, he says that he tells us this. His lesson is like this: warm up next to the light of the Chachamim. But then he says, this is what you have to be careful of. When you're going to get involved in these tremendously powerful people, what I mean powerful people, you think you're dealing with the president or the prime minister of a country, you think they have power. They do have power, so you become friends with them. It's great, but it's also danger. It's really risky to become friends with them, because if you upset them, then they could just kill you, type of thing. But he says this: the truth is that the people that have the real power are the Torah scholars. These are people that have pious, they've worked on themselves, and so to speak, when they give a blessing or a curse, it happens. And if you anger them, if you do something to go against them, then you're going to. Then you should be careful. So let's go back a step. This is, first of all, remember this: be respectful. Kavod chavercha. Remember to be respectful of them, of your colleagues. Don't get easily angry. Make sure to repent. And now, when you're going to come close to the wise people, you must come and warm yourself up. You must learn from them. but be careful. Hebe Zahir, be careful. Because if you mess around with them, then you're playing with fire. They have the bite of a fox. Now, there's deep meanings behind each of these examples, which I don't have time to get into already over time. But he's just telling us he was not careful. He had the power to do, he himself, he had spiritual powers, not black magic, spiritual powers. He was one with the Torah. He never sinned. He never wasted time. He studied and did good things all the time. But when he wasn't careful and he messed with his colleagues, there's no place for that. It's like the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I want to tell you a story. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, we know as is the person that promoted love more than any other person. Love of your fellow, whether you know them or not, no matter which group you're from, go out, show them love, care, even they could be a totally opposite side to you. But there were some times that he never, in the harshest of ways, he never accepted any type of nonsense. For example, he believed very strongly in the rule, the rabbis. There was once one of the Gaboyim that publicly did something wrong to one of the rabbis, the head rabbis of the Parnas community. And then that Gabbai would come up to get, the Rebbe would give out kosher bracha wine on Motzei Shabbat. After the Rebbe, that Gabbai did it, in front of thousands of people, the Rebbe ignored him. He wouldn't give him. Just moved on to the next person. Now, was the Rebbe trying to insult him or to humiliate him? I don't know. What I could tell you is that this person was dumbfounded. It happened once, it happened twice. He knew it wasn't a mistake. And that's when he publicly went in front of the whole of 770,000 people on Shabbos. He says, I want to apologize to this man, to this rabbi that I insulted or that I took away this. There was another person that something very similar happened when he refused to give a divorce to his spouse. The Rebbe also, he wouldn't give that person kosher bracha in front of everybody. After the Gabbai, I'm mixing the two stories, but the same thing happened. After the Gabbai went and made a public apology, Rebbe went straight back to normal, gave him all the respect, whatever he was getting before, and even more so. But you don't play. They're kind, they're good, but don't mess with them. You can't, be doing one thing and then expect other things from them. It's somewhat of a strange story. But what Rabbi Eliezer, what I understand is, Rabbi Eliezer learned a really powerful lesson. He himself was the greatest of rabbis in his time. But he fought not just against one rabbi, he fought against all of his colleagues. And he used his power to try to fight against them, and that was not okay. And he realized that. Yeah, and he knew himself. He knew from himself that if people messed, they got in big trouble. And the great example of this was the servant of Elisha, the prophet, right? One of the greatest miracle workers in all of history, brought people back from the dead, did incredible miracles. And Elisha had a servant by the name of Gehazi. Once Gehazi took advantage, there was a foreign king that came and needed a blessing and got a blessing, a cure. I'm not going to get into the whole story. Elisha told him to immerse himself in this water, and he did, and he got cured. And he wanted to give a huge donation to Elisha, and Elisha said, "No, I didn't do it for money." Anyway, the servant went and said, "Actually, my master behind his back said, my master wants the servant, wants the money." And Elisha found out about it. He said, "What he had, the leprosy, that sickness that he had, should be upon you." Was Elisha trying to do hard things? No, but you don't mess. They're very powerful people. They got lots of love. But when you mess with them, it's dangerous. You're playing with fire. So my understanding is, okay, thanks, David. My understanding is that Elisha was saying that Rabbi Eliezer is saying is just be careful. Warn, become closer, but don't play with fire. Fire has great abilities to warm you, but it also burns you if you come too close to it. So that's the way I understand it. He sounds like an angry man. I think more than angry man, he's a man that had learned the hard way. But it's different. In his case, he was one of them. And he is one of them. He dies as being, and they all acknowledge, they gave him all the respect towards the end of his life. All the respect. Okay, he goes down in history as one of the greatest rabbis, but he messed up.
That's why I wonder when he uses the term hachamim, he's referring to himself. Is he warning the other people against his own possibility of retribution?
I don't think so. It could be, but I don't think so.
It's possible to read it both ways.
It doesn't seem like he was trying to. The truth is, there is one. You actually are correct to a certain point. One thing that I forgot. It's not necessarily considered as a punishment, but when his colleagues come to him and visit him on his deathbed, one of the things he tells them is that they're going to be dying. They're going to have a strange death. This is one point that I've left out. He tells them you're going to have a strange death. And the ones that's going to have the harshest is going to be Rabbi Akiva. Those 10 colleagues end up being the 10 martyrs that we read about in Yom Kippur, that were killed by the Roman emperor. And Rabbi Akiva, of course, has the worst one, with his skin being peeled off him. So, but some understand that it was as a result that ultimately the rabbis were right and they said Judaism, but at the end of the day, they still messed with one of their great colleagues, not one of the greatest. And therefore, there had to be somebody that was willing to do it. And that was their sacrifice. You know, that they did it, they still would have done it, even knowing what was going to happen. It's not considered as though he punished them or that he cursed them. But that was an outcome of it. So did they at the end of the day go off innocently? No. Were they wrong? 100% not. If anything would have happened, if not for that story is literally, I didn't even get into all the details, but literally the story that saves the Jewish people from further destruction. Okay, we'll stop there. Hopefully we learned something interesting there, meaningful.
Very good. Thank you.
All right. Have a great day. Tzachi.
I was working, listening to your conversation, and it's a quite interesting discussion. I reckon you can talk about a few hours about this discussion.
Yeah, it's probably true. It's probably true. Tzaki, it's good to see everybody else.
Yeah, likewise. Have a Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom. Okay, bye.
Thank you very much, bro.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Rabbi.
Bye.